All right, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Well, welcome to the channel. Today we're rolling through another Just Chatting stream, and we may as well get ourselves underway. Hopefully, this will proceed a bit faster than we've had the last couple, but anyway, let's go. Okay, first thing today we're going to look at is more protests around the world. Now, we talked previous weeks about the protests in Nepal, in UK, in France, in Australia, in a bunch of other places. But the one in Nepal stood out because it was initially a younger generation protest, called a Gen Z protest, basically to begin with against the blocking or the banning of social media sites and apps and systems. And then it evolved into a more generic anti-corruption, anti-nepotism type protest, ended up seeing the collapse of the Nepali government, and well, they're having some arguments back and forth at the moment. There was some suggestion that they were using Discord to arrange a new government, and the couple of people that put forward seem pretty interesting. Um, have previously worked and done things in terms of government, but well, see how it goes. Plus, you're then dealing with only a small subset of the population who obviously have a very firm set of ideas on some things. Whether or not that's indicative and representative of the broader population, well, time will tell. Not quite sure at the moment. But what came out last night or this morning is that Madagascar has had its own set of Gen Z protests, as they're calling it. The protest is to do with initially uh, lack of utility supply, so lack of poor water and power supply. Ultimately, I'm sure there's more to it than that, but uh, that's what they're suggesting. And so the president has come out and said that right, that's it. Government can't do what they've been told to do, so we're getting rid of the government, and obviously going to have to elect again. And so people have been protesting, saying, look, we can't get the power and water and stuff that we need. It in an almost carbon copy of the Nepalese protests, they've killed at least 22 people in the, I'm guessing, the protesting side. And so, yep, there's obviously a fair bit of criticism about the degree of force being used by the security forces. Uh, that's coming out of the UN, though. Madagascar saying, no, no, not quite. But I guess we'll see once things settle down and a bit of time comes in. I mean, was it 19 to 22 were the figures given in the Nepalese protests? And in fact, on that, there's been online commentators who've received copyright strikes because they had footage of the protests recorded by another content producer, but it wasn't the content producer striking them. It was uh, some unknown party at the moment operating, they believe, out of India that, for whatever reason, was placing copyright strikes on the content. People were suggesting it was somebody or a group that wanted to suppress reporting on the protests and what was going on, which is possible. But I don't know how much further that investigation's gone or come to light. But well, it's a bit hard when people have been copyright struck to be able to go in and dig things up. But yeah, so yep, they've protested. The government's basically been um, uh, decided that yep, they're going to be dissolved, restarted. the not likely group, having a protest and civil disruption is an opportunity for, what's the best way to describe it? Well, it's an opportunity for other segments of the population to come out and exploit things. And so what you've got here is a statement from the UN about who the dead were is, okay, the protesters, bystanders, and then subsequent other violence, looting, etc. Just people engaging in criminal activity because they can. So it appears that they tried to head off the protests by sacking the energy minister, but wasn't enough, and they've pushed through. It's really only being seen, I mean, BBC, the ABC is really where I've seen the articles, and you can see it's only really recent that it's come to light. Uh, so, yep, they've dissolved it. They're giving the same sort of figures. If we go to the bottom, okay, so it's from Reuters. So it looks like the information's coming out of, okay, that's a very similar statement to what the BBC had. Um, and so it looks like the BBC rewrote the Reuters report, or the Reuters took their report from the BBC. But yeah, now interesting to note that the president had his initial power base coming in out of a coup, then stepping down in 2014, and then apparently winning in a democratic process after that. So his first time taken power, and the second time he's elected in. So it's interesting to see what goes on. Now, we covered this last time we talked about this at a protest, where they're saying, oh, there's right-wing groups using uh, online apps like Signal and Telegram and WhatsApp and all the other bits and pieces to organise and coordinate movement and things like this and that. But then there were people saying, oh no, we've been using this for protests that we like. Then there's the idea, but basically, as I pointed out, protests throughout history have always used the available technology at the time for communication and sharing information between each other. So, yeah, so we'll see more information, I guess, come out over time. But to be honest, there's generally not a lot of coverage of African news here in Australia. So I don't know that we're going to see much more. We may see the occasional article because of closely, how many similarities there are with protests in, say, Nepal. But beyond that, I don't know. I don't think we're going to see much more on that, sad to say. All right. Speaking of governments and protests and things like that, the last day or so, they've got the results now out of the Moldovan, I think that's correct. Yep, Moldovan, yep. Uh, election that was held, and the pro-EU party won. Okay, good. Well, not good in terms of who won. Good as in they've had an election, they've had an outcome. Doesn't appear to have been any violence. Everybody's happy. Well, not quite. So before the election, there was all these claims of Russian election interference, and the Russians were trying to, well, corrupt, influence the election. You hear, you heard very similar claims in the lead up to the Romanian elections and the influence there. The way I look at it is you've got one lot of people saying we're not interfering in the so stop interfering in the election that we're trying to interfere in, and the other side saying basically the same thing. So, yep, I don't think anyone would be surprised that there were Russian attempts to not necessarily influence the elect. Well, I mean, you could. It depends on how you define influencing. they're not going to, as long as they're not corrupting the election, then allowing Russian favoured or advertising, political advertising, advertisements in favour of Russian-aligned groups doesn't necessarily mean meddling or interference, because you're going to have very much the same on the other side, and it's a very fine line to be dancing down if you don't want people then to look at how you've been funded or who's meddling in your affairs. The thing to be concerned about, I guess, is the amount of meddling that the West has done, or Western Europe and the US and other aligned nations have done in the last 10 to 15 years and the outcomes that that's happened. So there was the Arab Spring, for example, where there are a lot of organic, in inverted commas, protests that erupted across the Maghreb and through the Middle East, seeking to overthrow the governments that were in power at the time, some of which were governments installed by coups, others were strongmen, others were nominally democratically elected but corrupt, all those other bits and pieces. The outcome of a rather violent and bloody Arab Spring in a number of nations was the installation of a more fundamentalist, more hardline, almost theocratic state as the nominal democratic groups that people thought had a chance of winning were swept aside because the broader voting population, the broader population, is astoundingly conservative or fundamentalist in their beliefs and felt that their representation was better achieved that way. And so this idea, this fiction that was sold that by creating this democratic process that you're going to magically achieve some sort of Nordic social democratic state that was at peace and everyone sat around the campfire singing Kumbaya, whereas it was probably more like Midsummer into the movie, not the celebration. So the issue out of that, plus, I mean, Gaddafi uh, met a rather brutal end, and, well, Libya, I don't think has really achieved stability since. You also had the civil war in Syria dragged on for quite a long time, and the question is now, has a more brutal strongman or more brutal group taken over compared to the allegations raised against the Alawites or against Assad and his family when they were in power? And what groups or what ethnic minorities within Syria are now protected or not? Yep. There was the claims and counterclaims in the Romanian elections to the point that they threw out the results that they didn't like, that the West didn't like. And so you've got these, and of course we're seeing mainly Western news, so it's obviously very much in favour of the Western viewpoint. If you want to avoid the allegations of meddling or corruption or interfering in an election, you've got to give it a chance to have an outcome that you may not like or want or force. I mean, even Euromaiden in 2014, very clearly meddled with by the West, to the point that here, 11 years later, well, 8 years when it happened, Russia invaded the eastern province oblasts to support the ethnic Russian communities living there that were disenfranchised from the process that went on. So Euromaidan was taking the western half of Ukraine and saying, we're going to do this, we're going to apply this everywhere in the eastern half. Well, the further east you went, the more Russian you became. That they were like, but no, we're not going to cut ties with Russia completely. We're not going to forget our heritage. just because you say so, or because somebody sitting in Brussels has made you a promise that, well, they're not following through on, really. But Moldova was, well, a tiny little country, again, formerly Russian when it was, or formerly under Russian control when the Cold War was on. So they've been independent for a while. The problem being here, and it's even freely admitted to the media, is it can be clearly, there can be some clear lines drawn about the potential for irregularities. And they're worth looking at, or they're worth clearer investigation to make sure that there is nothing, um, well, that it's all above board. But you're never going to avoid those allegations. It's like the referenda that Russia ran in Crimea and the Eastern Oblasts that went to say that, yep, no, we want to be part of Russia. We want Russia to be here looking after us. That was decried by, well, anybody who wasn't Russia as being farcical. Those of it not being as not being valid elections. Well, they're about as valid as what happened with Euromaidan. So anyway, we're not talking about them right now. So, yep, the pro-European party of the current president has claimed victory, and I think it's like 50.3% or something like that. Yep, complaining about Russian interference and um, saying Russia had thrown everything it had at the election. No, no, they hadn't. But hey, look, if it gets you headlines and makes someone in Brussels like you, then hey, fine, whatever. Um, yeah, okay, the opposition party's been a little bit delusional here. However, comma, 99% of the 1.6 million votes counted. It's a relatively small country. It is tiny. Like, if you've looked at a map, it's jammed in between Romania and Ukraine, and is um, and then even has a breakaway republic, Transnistria, I think it's called, which is even more ethnically Russian or more Russian aligned. So yeah, 50.17% of the vote. So basically, they've returned a majority. 24.1% for the Patriotic Electoral Bloc, which is Russian aligned. So yep, not a problem. Only half the population turned out. Again, coming from a country where voting is mandatory, the idea that you can have elections where barely half the voting population turns up and be able to claim a mandate from that just boggles the mind. I mean, the US has had issues over the years of people claiming that just because a president was voted in or a Congress was voted in the way it was, it doesn't really represent the populace because only a fraction, only a minority of the population came out to vote. Well, if you don't come out to vote, you can't claim they represent you or they don't represent you. Yeah, boggles the mind. Boggles the mind. Yep, obviously the EC president is like, yep, Europe, democracy, freedom. Yeah, yeah. Polish Prime Minister obviously stopped Russia in its attempts to take over the region. Okay, Zelensky obviously jumping up and down saying Russia's destabilizing activity loses. All right, they're gonna see things like that. What you want to hear though is what did the Russians say? Because if that first part of the article is correct, that the Russians are attempting to destabilize and whatever else, well, what do the Russians have to say in conclusion after the election? Okay, they're saying that there weren't enough polling stations in Russia, and some articles said that there was only two. Well, in fact, he just said there's two there, and that there was almost as many Moldovans in Russia as there were in Moldova, and they only had access to two polling stations. Now, clearly, the Moldovans in Russia are more than likely going to be voting in favour of a Russian-aligned political party. So when the US had their presidential elections and congressional elections, you hear lots of complaining about disenfranchisement of voters because there's not enough polling stations in minority areas or they're being open for fewer hours, all this sort of thing. It's attempts to disenfranchise voters by legally holding the election, but doing so in a manner that the eligible voter can't get to the polls or can't uh, complete a valid vote. So in this case, where you've got as many, well, allegedly as many Moldovans in Russia as there were in Moldova, only having two polling stations suggests disenfranchisement, at least if you're going to hold the election to the same standard that we want to hold everyone else to. So immediately that stands up as, okay, that's not great. Now, the country itself's only got a couple of million people. It may not have the funds to put 20 or 30 polling stations across Russia. So there's a cost, not an opportunity cost. It's a feasibility thing. Is it really feasible to have more than a couple of polling stations open for the diaspora? Well, possibly, because there was, um, I'm going to say, there were polling stations in many other countries as well. So the question is, okay, given how many would be in Russia versus other countries, is it appropriate to put more polling stations where there's more people, even if they don't believe in the party line of the party you want? Again, coming from a country where we have a quite independent, now there's allegations of a bit of influence, but the Australian Electoral Commission is pretty much independent of the political parties. It's a government body, so in essence, you could argue the government of the day controls it, but by and large, it's independent. And so they'll go through all the process of doing up polling papers, setting up polling stations, doing the order of candidates on the voting papers and everything, doing everything as possible to keep it above board. So coming to watch how other nations handle it is, again, just leaves me scratching my head as to how you get a process like that done without allegations of corruption, disenfranchisement, voter suppression, all those sort of things. I mean, maybe that's just the way people do things, and that it's expected to be expected to be corrupt in some way. The suggestion that recent votes are close, have been far closer than this election, also suggests that there may be something at play. If you've got, when you're looking at fraud through statistical means, accounting fraud generally, uh, financial fraud, you look for the aberration in the trend. You look for something that sticks out. And if the numbers return to the trend afterwards, you go and look, why did that figure stick out? Sometimes you just have an outlier, and that be the case. But generally, there needs to be a well understood reason for why these figures stick out. So you look at the US presidential elections, for example, there is a well defined trend in terms of voters for Republican and Democratic Party candidates over years. Like you can draw a very decent line of best fit. Now, the party figures like swap back and forth as they vote the president of that party in or out, etc. But by and large, there's a decent line of best fit that follows until you get to the 2020 election, where you had this incredible spike of returns, and the returns favoured Biden over Trump. And from a statistical point of view, from a trend line, it stands out as well. There's a clear if it's not an error, there's an outlier for a reason. Now, people point to the very high use of mail-in ballots as being the reason for that, or higher levels of engagement. But if that's the case, why didn't that happen in 2016 when people, by and large, believed that Hillary Clinton had it locked in? Why then wasn't it repeated in 2024 when you had the opportunity to vote Kamala Harris in? And the figures from 2016 2024 fit basically within the line of best fit, within reason. And so people look at that and go, the only other suggestion is that the election in 2020 was corrupted in some way. Now, clearly afterwards, Biden was appointed and carried on by the processes established, so it's academic, really. But to look at it, the arguments given for why that spike appears like it does fail the basic sniff test. They fail in comparison to prior and post other elections. It it doesn't stand up to scrutiny, really. And if you're looking at it in terms of an accounting spreadsheet as um, allocation of funds to various things, you'd see a spike like that as, hang on, there's something gone wrong there. It's like people who falsify figures. There's human patterns. People unwittingly default to certain patterns of numbers when making numbers up, and over time they'll stand out. And that's how financial fraud investigators and auditors, they're trained to look for this sort of stuff. So when you've got elections here, like here, where they say recent votes are far closer, or other elections in Moldova are generally much closer, to suddenly have such a big gap appear, you've got to ask what's caused it. Why is this the case? Now, you could argue that, oh, it's because of Ukraine, but you've got Transnistria, you've got plenty of Moldovans living in Russia, so that argument kind of falls flat a little bit. So the fact that they've returned a similar percentage for the party in power, okay, that's fair enough. The the inability of um, the inability of the Russian aligned party to return figures similar to their previous elections is what smells. Now, the OSCE, which I think it actually talks about it down here towards the end, um, European, or maybe it must be in the, might be in the in the ABC coverage. Anyway, so yep, they've returned. They may have to do a coalition with some of these other blocks in order to keep the Russian bloc out, but at over 50% of the return, that basically means that it's impossible to um, other well, for the Patriot Electric Bloc to form power, but it still needs additional power, additional returns. Yeah, bomb scares, but they're not saying where they came from. Um, Criminal groups backed by Moscow, apparently. So again, but that's the person in the Europeans aligned thing is obviously going to blame everybody else. Yep, Transnistria. There you go. Now, Transnistrians have Moldovan passports. It's still part of Moldova, but they are strongly aligned with Russia, and they're claiming that they were disenfranchised as well. And even though they've had a pro-European president, um, they've got high levels of inflation and high levels of corruption. So, yeah, you talk about scare tactics from the Russians. Well, this is scare tactics from the pro-European. Don't play with your vote, you'll lose everything. And yeah, well, that's this dude's a little bit deluded in that regard. We're good with that. Um, okay, uh, it's yeah. No, I think most people are like, yep, no, fair enough. The issue here as well is that they banned opposition parties right at the very close to the the point it was run. Now, um, the map here, so Transnistria is this little thin sliver next to Ukraine. Down here is Odessa, and I mean, you can see it's not even 20 k's across, and the whole country is only like 100 k's across. It's not massive. It's not a big country by any stretch of the imagination. But to have some of the opposition parties banned like days out from the election, yeah, that's not going to attract attention at all. And now it may be valid that okay that it was illicitly funded. Everybody's going to put themselves towards that. So unprecedented effort by Russia to spread disinformation and buy votes. I thought we moved past the whole idea of fake news. Well, it's pro-Russian propaganda and fake news. So that's just saying post content that opposes what the BBC says. Eh. Um, and quite likely, you've got you're hearing stuff now out of Russia or sympathetic to Russia saying that, well, no, you've done it to sow discord, and that you're uh, you're doing the same thing yourself as an effort to distract from the internal issues. So um, it's great that they've got processes to once you're in the polling station to attempt to ensure accuracy and everything else. But um, yeah, it's interesting. We'll see. Uh, scare scaremongering quite clearly. But who's to say? I mean, it sounds like people are afraid of a Cold War coming up. But and there you go. You disenfranchised voters inside Transnistria. Uh, Along queue cars waited to drive to 12 polling stations outside the border, some of them more than 20 k's away. So indicate that you've you returned much lower number of voters from that region, which speaks to disenfranchisement when you can so specifically tie it to an ideology, to a physical region, that these people here who are more likely going to be Russian aligned weren't able to vote or weren't able to vote effectively, and then had vehicles scanned and checked before moving through. So of course it's a procedural delay. It's work to rule, and so yeah, it's different. Now, there's an interesting statement for why he's voting against the government. Well, because they've promised the world and delivered nothing. So other than that, voting preference is secret, which is good, which is what you want. You want a secret ballot. You want obviously you you want people to walk out of the ballot booth knowing that how they voted is a secret and that their vote is counted accurately. You want it to be secret because you want to avoid standover tactics by political groups, by armed gangs, by criminal elements from a whole bunch of people. You want to allow people to have the freedom to make their own mind up and for that choice to remain private. But that's good. Um, so yeah, that's the initial thing. I mean, that was the first article I saw on it. We'll come back to that because the ABC had an article as well on the Moldovan outcome. Okay, yep, success. It's going to be coming off the wires. Yep, so ABC added it. So basically coming off the wires. I think this is the one that I saw that it had the OSCE element. So there's nothing new to be added up top here. Same basic percentages, same responses from European leaders, same rattling of sabers from Zelensky. Basically rewording the claim out of Russia about disenfranchisement due to only two polling stations. This is the first article though that points up uh, there being an energy crisis within Moldova, and that yep they are suffering an economic downturn. Quite clearly, we got one of their neighbours is busy engaged in a conflict. It's going to be difficult. Um, in a sense, surprising that a government party managed to hold on to a majority in parliament and not get its position eroded. Well, it did. It was down to 50.1 from 54, even with the inability of Transnistrians to get to polling stations or Moldovans in Russia to get to more than two polling stations. Yeah, you can't claim no one was disenfranchised as a result. Although they're still saying all the Russians did multiple destabilizing techniques and malign interference in electoral processes. We just explain the irregularities or the things that are going to stand out that deserve to have a good answer provided for them. It's like Russia was interested in Moldova because its position could allow a second front to be opened in its war in Ukraine. No, no, you're jumping at shadows there. I I don't think Moldova is necessarily more important than say Odessa. It's certainly something that Russia, if it was to take Odessa, would certainly be okay with connecting up with Transnistria and potentially the rest of Moldova, but I don't see it as having a geostrategic importance more than, say, Odessa. So, but hey, you're allowed to express your national interests. Uh, this is a statement that wasn't in the BBC article and doesn't seem to have really any basis in any reporting that's come out in the last several years. That they're using it as a lab for hybrid warfare. But question is, like, okay, so they're claiming hybrid warfare is like using drone attacks and everything else. It's like, well, hang on. The more open reporting about alleged Russian interference in elections and stuff, apart from the US, is in Romania, and well, or even, I mean, Germany to an extent with the AfD, but well, I think people realise that's just rhetoric. Uh, and even in Romania, it's not been proven or demonstrated that anything other than the fact the non-EU aligned people won in the first rounds. So, um, good that everyone feels free to vote. Uh, Obviously, they were part of the breakup of Russia, the USSR. Okay, so they targeted illicit party funding and alleged Russian-backed networks. So, uh, how is that any different from European-based backed networks on the other side? And that's the thing. You've got to be fair. You've got to allow people to have their voice, even if you don't like that voice. So I didn't know that the opposing guy was prior president, but I don't think the documents claiming electoral violations are going to go anywhere. Sorry to say. They're declaring, this is where he's declared that the diaspora was what held the voting together for the party returned in power, because, well, obviously there's a lot working through Europe, but the they go in a little bit more detail here about the Transnistria things. Transnistria? Well, depending on where you read it. So the article says, he said without providing evidence that the people living there, more than 200,000 of them, that's more than enough to swing the election, were denied the chance to vote. Okay, fair enough, you can argue that. The current president, said, oh, no, we could not influence what happened in a region that did not recognise Moldovan government control. Huh. Well, are they part of your country or not? So they didn't provide, from the other article, no, they didn't provide any voting stations inside the region. He forced them to leave the region, and then went over each and every vehicle and group of people that left to vote. Forced them to show papers and investigated vehicles. Yeah. So the OSCE. Now this group is one that I'd never heard of prior to, say, 2016-ish. Well, maybe the 2014, but they're a group which I'm not 100% sure who coordinates them, whether they're out of the EU or not, but they were present in Luhansk and Donetsk pretty much from 2014, documenting what they saw. Now, clearly, they only had access allowed to them by whoever was fighting, uh, predominantly Ukrainian access, but they did a fairly decent job trying to provide a balanced view, not necessarily a balanced viewpoint, to try and provide a neutral viewpoint on what was going on, or attempted to document more than anything else. And so to see them show up for this election, yeah, cool. All right, what have they got to say? It's competitive despite flaws. The fact that it's competitive, even with the claims of suppression, makes me wonder what sort of returns the other party would have had everyone been able to vote. So, yeah, a high level of commitment to democratic processes, not a problem. Unprecedented hybrid threats coming from Russia, which doesn't explain what they are. It's easy to have a throwaway line like that as an to uh, excuse for the excesses that you carry out yourself, not the OSCE. Yep. So the OSCE said, yep, removing those parties from the ballots a couple of days before, limited their right to seek remedy, and yep, there was illegal financing was the alleged reason why. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. Yeah, 7% inflation, power problems. Yeah, that's an issue for them, sadly. All right, what? So that's Moldova. That's elections. Not gonna do much in terms of Russia and Ukraine and stuff. There's been some YouTube videos from armchair generals that I've seen in the last couple of days, and I had a quick look through their history. That every time Zelensky sneezes, it's Ukraine's going to win the day, and it's all great for the last 4 years plus. And every time Putin sniffs, he's got pneumonia, he's going to die, and Russia's going to collapse. They're almost universally one-sided and heavily slanted, and it's like if a Russian trips over on the front lines, it's a sign that Russia's going to be driven back to the Kamchat, driven back to the Bering Sea and into the Bering Sea, and there's nothing the Ukrainians do that is wrong. And sadly, they get millions and millions of views, and you read through the comments, it's like, no, not even a dissenting opinion, not even, there's no alternative opinion being put forward anywhere. And so when you get the mainstream media even picking up and saying, oh, Ukraine's doing this wonderful stuff, well, vile Russian strikes lasting 12 hours. Before we go into it, yeah, okay, the Russians are doing drone and missile strikes, saves on people, I guess. They've carried it on. And when I see these other commentators going about how wonderful the air defense system in Ukraine is going to be and everything else, it's like, well, if it's so wonderful, how come Russia can launch and sustain such prolonged attacks against Ukrainian territory all over Ukrainian territory if these Wunderwaffe systems are in place and working? Maybe things are more nuanced than the garden path they're trying to send us down. The incursions into Poland and Romania should also not be happening if their air defense system is as wonderful as it is, or the incursions have been launched by another actor and not Russia. We'll see. I think a lot of those commentators, especially when you look at their videos and the number of years and what they keep saying and saying and saying, it's like at some point you either commit to a lie and keep selling it, or you're going to have to stop and wind back some of what you've said in order to better reflect the reality on the ground. And so that, I don't know, it's a bit hard when you don't get to see the Russian side of things. I'm sure there's Telegram and other content out there, but it tends to be tucked away or not really covered. Yeah, even if it's blatantly propaganda, it's still important to see and hear a viewpoint from the other side so that at least you get the basis, the beginnings of a balanced understanding of what's going on. So to have these articles come out screaming and crying about a 12-hour attack against Ukrainian targets, particularly now that they're reaching into Kiev constantly, it's uh, well, the question I have from all of that is if all these other articles I'm being told are accurate, how is this happening? How is this able to keep happening repeatedly and seemingly at will? It looks like, from how the articles are presenting the actual attacks going on, I would say that it looks like the Russians have the ability to attack at will with unmanned vehicles and missiles anywhere within Ukraine. And they haven't even started in on their longer range, larger systems, um, IRBMs and such as were used by Iran and the Houthis against Israel. Yep, they haven't really made an appearance yet. When they do, well, I guess that's an escalation because a lot of them can be nuclear tipped. Um, Going back the other direction, well, similar sort of things. So you go, well, is it just a unilateral action? Is it just Russia smacking Ukraine because they can with massive missile strikes? Well, there's been missiles flying in the other direction as well that have penetrated whatever air defense systems Russia's got, have entered Russian territory and have been hitting a lot of refineries. There was stuff I saw yesterday about a electronics plant that was known to produce wiring harnesses and circuitry for guided weapons and military platforms. That was hit pretty badly, and there's a lot of celebration going on in um, those YouTubers, stuff like that, with the emergence of the Flamingo ground launch cruise missile, which, for all measures, looks like an upgraded V1. or a combination between that and a Jindavik drone from the 1970s, 1980s, which was a unmanned drone, targeting drone developed by Australia. I don't think it ever could have carried weaponry. It was designed as a targeting drone for air gunnery and missiles and things like that. I mean, this Flamingo design looks like something from the 40s to the 70s. But look, it's apparently being effective. And you've got, again, you had article after article after article saying the Russians could no longer produce drones, they've run out of missiles, run out of everything else. Yet they're continuing to launch hours and hours and hours long attacks against Ukrainian targets without seemingly being bothered by Ukrainian air defense systems. Hmm. I think we're being sold a lie to an extent. That the reality is maybe not as bleak as Russian sources might claim, but uh, it's it's not as sunshine and rainbows or as wonder waffer as a lot of even I saw on Twitter and X this morning, people were celebrating these ideas used for cutting fiber optic cables of fiber optic controlled drones on the battlefield. And they were a technological failure. Not the drones, but these methods for countering them, because it failed to take into, well, it might have worked on the ground or on the bench, but the amount of, like, there are actual physical reasons why it could not work. And um, it posed more of a threat to the operator than it did to any opponent you were trying to take on, which is not the sort of weapon system you want to have, or even counter system you want to have. There was also an article saying there was an Australian developed laser defense system coming through that apparently will be heading to Ukraine to help counter Russian drones. But at the same time, there was another article starting to consider the risk of, well, they call it sabotage by Russia or Russian-aligned interests for having been so actively engaged in uh, being actively involved in in the Ukrainian conflict. And so it well, also makes sense that those sort of things are to be expected. I talked about it a while back about, well, if you're going to contribute militarily, like bombs and bullets to one side over another, you can't pretend that you're neutral. And so when the other side decides to come looking, you're gonna you can't claim that your hands are clean. So yep, they massive attacks, plenty of regions, etc. Russia would not stop its aggression with Ukraine, according to Zelensky. Of course, he's gonna talk his legs off no matter what, and um, they're conflating the Danish event, which the Danes still haven't come out and said where they've come from. Now, I think, based on what I've been reading, it's going to turn out to be either civil in origin or not Russian. But again, interesting to see what'll happen. Enhanced surveillance and an air defense frigate. Well, it, it's interesting. So Denmark said there's no evidence to suggest Russian involvement in, and Russia said wasn't us. So it'll be interesting. The reason I sort of brought up the Russian thing, the Ukrainian thing, was more. because I'm a firm believer in the idea. Okay, that's a video. A firm believer in the idea that if you are trying to work out why something's being done or what's going to be done, that if someone comes along and says, I'm going to do this, it makes sense to listen to them because they're telling you why they're doing what they're doing. It's the reason why I advocate reading the books of political leaders from before they took power, because it explains their rationale for doing what they're going to do. And I've talked about that previously, including despots and authoritarians and people who've been horrible stains on history because they explain their reasoning. And corrupted as it may be, you can understand then, you can better understand why they did what they did because they've used their own words to tell you. The UN General Assembly has had some interesting speakers and events over the last over the last week. The Russians were one of the last groups to get up and speak, and the Russian foreign minister. Now, this guy's kind of interesting. People are sort of whispering that he may be, if he was 10 years younger in particular, but that he may be one of the next, g'day Ash, saying that the Russian foreign minister might be the next candidate off the ranks to replace Putin whenever Putin retires or dies in office or whatever Putin's plan is for leaving power is. They don't see Medvedev as being the next big candidate. It's this guy. And so when this guy gets up and talks about things, it's probably worth having a good listen to because not only is it explaining what Russia's doing and wanting to do now, but it's probably going to leave echoes if he ends up taking power. You're going to see echoes coming forward in what he's trying to say and do. So Sergei Lavrov. So keep that name in your minds because we may see him being the next Russian leader after Putin and Medvedev um, leave power by whatever means. So Lavrov, lots of other countries sent their leaders. They sent the foreign minister, which is also a sign. So if a lot of other countries, say US, Australia, Israel, their leaders all got up to speak. Okay, so that sets a certain tone. That sets a certain level of what you expect other nations to do as well. So who gets up to speak for the Russians? The foreign minister. Now, is that because they're positioning him to be the next leader, or what? And so that's another reason why I think Lavrov's uh, being not necessarily groomed, but certainly on his way for it. Certainly a person to keep tabs on going forward. That doesn't mean anything, Ash. That doesn't mean anything. You can, if you're not party to the ICC, just like Israel's not, and America's not. There's plenty of countries that have people have attempted ICC warrants against Netanyahu for what's gone on in Gaza and things like this. The Americans basically said that if any American ever gets arrested by the ICC and taken to trial in The Hague, basically The Hague will cease to exist because they will go in and get their people back. So the ICC is quite sadly a bit of a sham because it requires everybody to buy into it. And if big powers don't buy into it, then its effectiveness is limited. So Roger Duterte, and I did have this article previous week, Roger Duterte did, one of the previous Philippine leaders. He's under trial now in the ICC for his anti-drug policies, the ones that basically gave free rein to shoot drug dealers. And whilst people were unhappy with what he'd done, The whole reason he's sitting in the ICC is because there's a Marcos back in power in the Philippines, and it's bad blood between them, and so it's seen as a political arrest more than anything else. And so when only people that the West don't like end up in the ICC, it feeds into criticisms that the ICC is not a universal system. It's a very selective political process. So the whole idea of the General Assembly is that irrespective of your arrest warrants for the ICC, they've had genocidal maniacs speak at the General Assembly. It's part of the UN Charter and mandate and everything else like that, and it's guaranteed safe passage during that period. I mean, Sarkozy just got arrested for things, and he's facing a 5-year prison sentence. If Sarkozy had spoken at the General Assembly when he was the president of France, does that mean he probably should have been arrested because he was doing the naughty things at the time? Yeah, the whole concept of, I mean, and that's one reason they put the General Assembly, the UN in the US was that, and how it was set up was to allow safe passage and basically sort of guaranteed safety of you come in, talk, go back, then all bets are off again. Um, uh, it's not a unique concept globally. In Afghanistan, I can't remember the name of what it was, but basically, if the tribal leaders invited you to tea, um, you'd go. And so you'd have at these little, not tribal councils, but these little churas? No, that's not the name of them. But basically, you'd have American or NATO military people sitting down with tribal leaders and the Taliban having tea because that's the way it's done. Now, the fact that after everyone leaves and go back to their respective bases, they go back to killing each other, by and by. But for the period of the the um, of being called a council, effectively, you went and behaved yourself. So it's not, like I said, it's not unique globally. But anyway, yeah. So Lavrov, and I'm sure people have blamed him for plenty of things too. So Sergei Lavrov has basically said Russia is being concerned about threats being levied by Western countries. If you've been watching the news, you could certainly see how they perceive that, like NATO's response to Russian flights down the middle of the Baltics, incidental penetration of Estonian airspace, the saber rattling that's going on. You can understand how the Russians are like, this we start to see this as a bit of a threat. Russia and Israel is an interesting one. Um, they've certainly, because Russia's, I guess, supported Iran or been friendly with Iran and Syria, that they probably have not a lot of love lost for the Israelis. But at the same time, I think they're fairly neutral towards them. They're not massively in favour of them. They're not massively out against them. But the for Lavrov to come out and say, look, yep, they didn't like what Hamas did. They think that Israel were heavy-handed in their response. Okay, that's kind of interesting statement on that. So we skip past that. Um, uh, Sanctions, yep. Okay, well, obviously, if you're the ones on the receiving end, you think they're going to be illegal, etc. Uh, I wasn't aware that Russia and China had attempted to delay the sanctions being reimposed for a particular reason. I didn't see that article, so I don't know what they did to try and delay it. But obviously, Russia and China are like, And that's the thing. When you're sanctioning such a large portion of the world's population, again, I've talked about this before, you've got to ask yourself, why? What is it going to affect? eventually, who's going to suffer the most out of it? If over half the world's population is being sanctioned by, uh, we talk about democratic processes. If more than 50% of the world's population you've deemed to be evil, well, maybe it's your position that needs to be reevaluated. So the big statements, though, were to do with what's happening in Europe and Ukraine. This is, I think, the key part to take away from the message is that, yes, they're seeing what NATO's doing and the articles in the Western media. What that's doing is increasing threats of force against Russia and accusing Russia of basically preparing to attack NATO and EU and everything else. And he said, well, Putin's said no. This is a very, very clear statement that follows that Russia has never had and does not have such intentions, but any aggression against my country will be met with a decisive response. All right, so that first half of the statement is telling everyone they're dreaming. The second half is you touch us, we're going to touch you back. That, whatever else you think about what's gone on in the world in the last 10 or 15 years, is a pretty reasonable statement. It's a pretty fair statement. The the same thing goes for people who say, well, Russia's being held behind the lines in Ukraine and we're winning and everything else like that. When you've got to go back to the statements made 2021 and earlier by Putin about if he was going to go into Ukraine, here are the limits on what we're going to do and why we're going to do it. And if you look critically at the situation, ignore all the reporting, just look at where the front lines are and have been. That seems largely, not completely, but largely to be the case. And people say, well, oh no, Kiev's at risk and all the other stuff's at risk. Again, we talked before about the different missiles and stuff in use. There is a lot of stuff, even in the intermediate range class of weapons, that Russia is sitting on and has shown no interest in using. They've certainly not been using their backfires or bears massively. I mean, they've used them to launch weapons from inside Russian territory, but they've not taken the Cold Warfare approach to steamroll west until they hit the English Channel. No, no, they've. I don't think there's anyone who's going to deny that they've dug in depth. They've taken what amounts to a defensive position now. And people say, well, that's because they've run out of people. Uh, well, you could argue that, but I'd also argue that they've got the territory they intend to hold, and they're stopping. Well, they're not making moves to push further west. They've dug in depth. They've got their multi-layered defences well established. It's a defensive line now, and uh, yeah, I mean, they've kettled Ukrainians from time to time. They've shown no desire to push further. Well, no practical intent to push further. People say, oh, they don't have the equipment to do so. Well, yeah, they do. They're just not using it and haven't shown a desire to use it. And even if Ukraine, with their recent Flamingo attacks, manages to take out refineries in the West and factories in the West, you're going to run into the same problem that Germany did in World War II, in that Russia is a monster of a country that extends so far to the east. All they have to do is move their production facilities east of the Urals and carry on. It's exactly how they produced enough T-34s to roll over Poland and Germany in the 1940s. And if people think Russia hasn't remembered that lesson, well, you're going to find out in the next couple of years. So we'll see on that regard. But that was a little bit of a sidetrack there. So yeah, I think this is one of the clearest statements about Russia's position on what's been going on of late. And is it something that ignoring what happens in the media and isolated incidents, is this something we're going to see people see them stick to? Hmm. Personally, I think we will. I think we will. I wish I had access to Russian media that was on the same level as Western media to get a bit of a look on this, but yeah, not really. It's not. I don't can't find it. Can't find it in English. So I'm sure it's out there. But yeah, it's hard trying to interpret what another side's doing if you can't read what they're telling you you're doing. Um, so yeah, the fact that NATO stepped up their stuff, Russia's basically saying, look, we don't like it. Fair enough. Um, yeah, okay, it's a repeat of stuff. I don't. I mean, the important part of this article is what Lavrov had to say. I don't know where Trump came from with this. Clearly, someone got into his ear and told him something, or he believed something, because it's a almost a reversal of his prior position that he thinks that Kiev could win back all of Ukraine. I don't know how. I don't know what with, because they've already deployed Abrams and Leopards and um, Patriot batteries and F-16s and M155s and uh, Jeopards. No, there's a basically javelins and all sorts of stuff. And I don't think there's been a fundamentally substantive gaining of territory or regaining of territory that Ukraine has achieved, even with all that hardware and the fact it's drained Western military um, resources. It it doesn't make sense. I don't know where he's coming from. I mean, the fact the Flamingo has appeared, but it's ground launched cruise missile. Eventually, the Russians are going to target those production facilities and those storage facilities. It's not going to be the game changer, I think, that a lot of people are claiming. The sustained Russian drone attacks indicates that the air defense systems are not a bother for the Russians. So if Ukraine is going to regain territory that is held by a massively dug in, now we're going to just toss away who's fighting who here, just straight military tactics and logistics. Again, attacking a dug in defensive force, you're going to need at least 5, 6 to 1 attacking ratio. You're going to need integrated fires, so you're going to need control of the air, which, well, neither side truly has. And you're going to need, and you're going to attack against a system that has effective counter artillery already set up and sighted, and heavy artillery already sighted on likely attacking lines. The Yeah, it's going to make the Somme, it's going to make the Western Front in World War One look like a picnic. There's even even with a wonder weapon. Now, if you went and used a tactical nuke or something like that, well, that's just going to invite being steamrolled next time something happens. But it just doesn't make sense, especially moving into the northern winter. So the fighting season effectively on the plains there is gone. Um, Russia missed any chance to push to the Dnieper, and Ukraine missed any chance to push back. I mean, waterways form much of the boundary of fighting as it is at the moment. So, from a pure military, strategic, and tactical point of view, I don't know where Trump thinks he's getting this from. Short of boots on ground by Western militaries, and that'll be a very, very bad thing. Uh, yeah, the one chance of a breakout, I think the Russians hold that card, but they've dug in. They're not showing expeditionary markers. They're not showing a desire to push forward. Now, they probably could. They could probably push the front lines for another 50 or 60 Ks at significant cost. Far easier than Ukraine could push them back 50 or 60 Ks. Unless it comes to a peace treaty and Putin willingly gives up that territory, I don't see Ukraine ever getting it back. Sorry, that's just a reality of dug in things. And the fact that the last couple of asymmetric warfare engagements, i.e., Iraq, Afghanistan, um, were effectively lost, drawn out combat. Libya, you might say, oh, that was a win, but there were plenty of things about it that weren't a win. None of them were against an equivalent system. Now, the last time you had an asymmetric win like this was probably Israel taking the Golan Heights. Um, they defeated a much stronger Syrian tank force, at least numerically, um, but or even defeating Egypt in the Sinai. Probably the last big examples where a numerically inferior force, maybe roughly equivalently equipped or maybe even better equipped, took on a much larger defending or attacking system and won. I can't see a repeat of that. Not with the level of training and capability on each side. So I don't know where Trump's getting this from or who told him sweet nothings. But anyway, it is still promising though to see what Lavrov had to say here at the end. That in the approaches to the current administration, we see a desire not only to contribute to ways to realistically resolve the crisis, but also a desire to develop pragmatic cooperation without adopting an ideological stance. Again, that's a really good statement and a really positive statement to hear. You didn't hear Lavrov beating the drums of war, of threatening to roll over Europe or stomp all everything. And an example I saw come up in discussion, was it today? It might have been last night, was about Georgia. Obviously, Russia and Georgia had a bit of a fisticuffs a few years back. Georgia was heading EU bound, or at least trying to align themselves with the EU. They're too far east to be part of the EU. You also then had Russia sort of stepping in and say, look, South Ossetia has asked us for help. We're going to go and help them. And it was also the first time I had seen footage of drones being shot down. Uh, there were engagements where Russian fighters shot down drones being used by the Georgians or other people helping them out. Uh, but it ended, the conflict ended. Georgia still exists as a country. It's still, well, as far as I'm aware, independent from Russia. And it's like, well, the whole argument of, oh, Russia's just going to steamroll them and get rid of them or reabsorb them. Well, I mean, Russia fought two very bloody wars in Chechnya. And Chechnya, while it's, I guess, in the orbit of Russia, still exists. Georgia still has pretty much its full independence. So I don't see where the argument here in Ukraine and the rest of Europe goes. I'd be willing, it may be a stupid thing, but I'd be willing to take Russia at face value for what they're saying here. So it'd be interesting. And this throwaway line at the end here is about, well, why did you wait so long to recognise Palestine? Is it because you hoped there would be no one and nothing left to recognise? Stab. Stab, 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 stab. Yeah. All right. Okay. Next. Next. So that's all out of that. Since we talked a little bit about Trump, we may as well hop into this. There's a couple of things. There's some big news we're going to cover just yet. This one. Um, so Trump got a payout from Paramount slash CBS, whoever it is that has 60 Minutes, got a payout from them, and is now getting a payout from YouTube. And we talked about the letter written by Alphabet slash Google to the House Judiciary Committee, and then that was then published by Rep. Jim Jordan on Twitter, and a lot of people were pretending it didn't exist because it made everyone look bad. That was the article um, that I saw in the Post Millennial, but not where much else, where Google admitted to subverting the voices of people critical of the COVID-19 response and critical of various other bits and pieces, of taking steps beyond, so for suppressing, shadow banning, deleting accounts of people who, whilst they were creating content within the guidelines, within YouTube's guidelines and Google's guidelines, were still being shut down because the Biden administration didn't like it. And everyone's screaming about Trump being an authoritarian. But anywho, I didn't know that he had sued Google as well, or Alphabet, uh, and he's now won. So YouTube slash Google is paying $22 million to Donald Trump. Not going to him directly. He has said that he wants to go to the Trust for the National Mall, which he said is then going to be used to contribute towards payment for the ballroom at the White House. It, it's it's an interesting way, and then a couple of $1 million to a bunch of other people as well. Uh, and it appears to be a settlement, not a court-driven thing, because a whole bunch of social media companies suspended the accounts. Meta, so Facebook, I didn't realize, I must have missed it. Uh, Paid 25 million US at the start of the year in acknowledgement of the fact that, well, Insta and Facebook and all the other Meta companies had banned him or suspended his accounts. X, under, well, Twitter as it was at the time, under Jack Dorsey. I don't think Elon Musk has suspended any of Trump's accounts since he took over, but another 10 million. The settlement doesn't constitute an admission of liability. Well, everyone's just going to see it as that. Uh, the timing, that it came a week before a scheduled hearing to discuss the case. And again, it comes on the heels of the letter that I talked about, which are the reinstatement of people who'd been banned, shadow banned, and deleted for COVID misinformation and things. Um, uh, it values conservative voices on its platform and that recognises these creators have an extensive reach, i.e., bring money in, and play an important role in civic discourse. So they are admitting to being overtly biased and political in how they did things. Again, everyone's screaming about Trump being authoritarian. There's at least 3 court cases there, 3 settlements there uh, to do that. Um, yeah, no, no, no. Well, I don't know if this was a YouTube thing, but his Twitter account at the time was shadow banned, suspended, and it's like this statement could apply to the Twitter one as well, but it was shown to be false. That if inciting violence, when the last message that Trump attempted to send that was suppressed was basically go home in peace, do not cause any, like, go in peace, go home, and that message was suppressed. And so people are like, Trump ordered this. Well, no, his messages actually said, go home, don't be violent, go home. And yeah, Well, they weren't certifying Joe Biden at the time, and well, we talked about numbers and stuff like that. Yeah, got to get a stab in. Got to get a stab in. Anyway, uh, since that's positive Trump news, it's got to be countered. The media can't let things be. They've got to go after it. Trump's political hit list. Okay, so Comey was indicted for lying to Congress. Okay, it seems fairly cut and dried what he did. It's being run through the system and everything else. The last significant apparently politically driven case of someone being arrested or indicted for lying to Congress was Roger Stone, who was well, he's a neocon more than anything else, but he was in Trump's orbit and helping Trump out and everything else like that. He was arrested with a 6 a.m. FBI raid on his house, no knock, kick in the doors sort of thing, uh, scuba swimmers in the river behind the house, all that sort of stuff. The guy was in his 60s, 70s. He's no history of violence or anything like that. But basically, they've come in boots swinging, hoping for some sort of conflict with the camera crews from CNN and, well, the media was there, but CNN in particular. And so it was like, well, how did CNN know that this was about to happen? How did anyone know that this was about to happen? And why go to that extent? You've militarized things, and you could have just arrested them simply, but no, it was played up as being, it was alleged that it was a politically driven hit attempt, and the fact that the indictments had been leaked to CNN, hence why they were there and everything else, was also done for political smear reasons. Okay, so people were like, okay, that was bad. Some people were like, oh, he deserved it. Others were like, look, irrespective of whether you think he deserved it or not, the being indicted, the process by which it was carried out is not appropriate. And so when Comey gets indicted, all of a sudden the media is crying and wailing and gnashing teeth, and it's like, well, as it's political hit lists and Trump's doing, it's like, well, he's been given the uh, the benefit of the law. It's going through judicial processes far more than anybody else who was targeted in such a manner. If you're going to say it's a political hit, then you're going to look at the 87,000 IRS agents, armed RAS agents that Biden's administration was trying to bring in. You're going to go back and look at what Obama was doing with using the IRS against the Tea Partiers, who'd emerged as a more conservative group than the Republicans back in the day. And so this idea that, oh no, Trump's being some horrible dictator because Comey has finally been indicted for lying to Congress, it's not because he's done or said something that Trump did, it's because he's lied to Congress. And that's what he's being indicted for. Now, there's plenty of people who think he should be arrested and charged with a lot more, but that's what the indictment's for. So they're they're pushing on here that, oh no, it's political enemies, etc. Now, the reason he's brought up some of these people like George Soros and Reid Hoffman, etc., is to do more with the political violence or the um, ideological violence and protests and stuff that's going on. The protesting's fine. It's when it leads to violence and vandalism and destruction of property and everything else that most people are like, you've gone too far. And assassination of Charlie Kirk and the shooting of Steve Scalise, uh, I mean, a long list. Okay, a long list, despite what the ADL says, a long list. And it's reasonable irrespective of which side of politics is doing this or is claiming to do this, it's a reasonable statement to say we should be chasing down, investigating whether or not there are organisations continually funding what ends up being political violence in the streets, because that is consistent political violence by one party or one group that's chasing or forcing an ideology is the literal definition of terrorism. And so if there are consistent organisers and groups behind it, then they should also be looked at as enablers. And I mean, kind of how RICO works and how they went after various terrorist groups in the past is you do your best to fight the terrorists in the battlefield or on the field where they're doing their violence, but you go after their funding. Cut off their funding, they eventually dry up. Which is why he's talked about George Soros and Reid Hoffman, etc. George Soros with his open foundation, I forget the exact name of it, but he has notably openly funded a lot of very leftist groups and engaged in political processes and stuff to spend his money very much on the left side of things. That's fine, but the question is, has some of that been used now because Trump's in power for Antifa or groups aligned like them to carry out violence on the streets? If so, that needs to be addressed. Reid Hoffman's similar sort of thing. So people are like, oh no, he's chasing after these leftists. Well, it's because of how they're funding things. And oh no, he's chasing after Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York. Well, people have such a short memory that they can't remember 12 months ago. Well, 18 months, 2 years ago, with how she got elected, with the I'm getting elected on the basis that I'm going to go after Trump. That's it. That's why she was elected. Uh, and the lawfare, as it's called, that was carried out against Trump in the state of New York, the SDNY, Southern District of New York, um, and the various cases and court cases, and they're the reason why people say, "Oh, Trump's a convicted felon." Well, no, it was um, a long stretch. It was bending the legislation and the law so hard that even people that weren't necessarily Trump supporters, but who were very, very, very well respected lawyers coming out going, look, no, 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 you've gone too far. You've violated various rights under the Constitution. You've engaged in, I forget the term, where it's basically a targeted, they've created legislation specifically to target him that then expired immediately after the prosecution started. Um, that they judge shopped, they stacked things as much as they could, and still the guy walked free. So yeah, Letitia James, John Bolton, well, he deserved it, and it showed up that he had uh, classified material, which they tried to nail Trump to the wall on, but let Biden go on. But they had more than just that. He said some stuff, and he was suspected of leaking material, and fine if that's the case. I mean, General Flynn got hammered for far less. Adam Schiff, oh, there's uh, he runs his mouth because the moment he stops running his mouth, people are going to look at what he said, and there's some evil stuff in what his background is. Um, but hey, look, you can oppose Trump, but you go to the extent that Schiff has, or there's some stuff there which is like you question whether that is legal even under the ability of congressmen or senators to say things in Congress. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, there's no hiding that Trump doesn't like those guys, and he's certainly going through judicial processes. Hasn't gone about it it certainly hasn't weaponized the system the way that the Democratic Party did against specifically Trump between 2020 and 2024, and even before 2016. It's just you then look at it, it's like, well, where's their corruption? And um, yeah, I mean, okay, he sees them as radical leftists. Yep, fine, not a problem. You can see that, and I mean, that's crap. That is utter crap. Sorry to say. The Justice Department is not traditionally independent from White House interference. When Lance Armstrong was facing a grand jury investigation for his alleged, at the time, performance enhancing drug taking, uh, the Obama White House made some noise, and magically the grand jury investigation disappeared. Hmm, okay. Uh, and you look at how the Justice Department was used against FBI being part of the Justice Department against Roger Stone, all the cases raised against Trump. It's uh, and subsequently all the all the payouts, all the admissions that um, basically there was nothing to the cases. So career prosecutors, it's kind of been tradition that district attorneys are fired by the incoming administration. Bill Clinton kind of was a classic example of that. Wipe the slate clean to appoint district attorneys he wanted. And that's certainly politicizing the system. So it's just falling out. They're complaining, they're whining, they're crying that Trump is using the system within the boundaries of the system, as we've seen in previous whinging articles. Uh, that um, it's and this is what I was saying as well about being careful about introducing a political weapon that you're going to use against your opponent, because at some point that's going to be turned around back on you. And the idea is here that there's people who might have previously been seen as immune. No, no, they're coming under criticism and mishandling things. It's just uh, it's one thing. So yeah, they're whining and carrying on about Letitia James and everybody else. And the funny thing is, the very claim that they use to slam Trump is the very, very, very same issue that she's got and Jon Stewart, the comedian, had. And so basically, so many people are like, oh, ha, ha, Trump's naughty. A lot of the leading voices on it were like, wait a second. People looked at them and went, ha, you've done the exact same thing. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And a lot of people were like, no, no, we shouldn't. Open Society Foundations. That's the one that Soros leads. And so, like, being investigated doesn't mean you're going to be um, targeted. Oh, it's from the Washington Post. What a surprise. I thought it was written by Australians. Well, it's by the Washington Post. Well, that would explain it. There is one other one, though. We've got this trash appearing again, where it's saying that he's being a dictator. Again, we just talked about how Biden's administration was used the systems to target Trump and his circle. And I mean, there's times when Melania Trump and I think Barron Trump as well were debanked at some point the banks refused to do business with them because of political pressure. And it's like, no, everyone looked the other way. Everyone looked the other way. But it's time to be yelling and screaming about this. This is now false. It, 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 it's a statement of fact. When it's not a statement of fact, it's was alleged to begin with. It was alleged Russian interference, and the investigations showed that, well, there was none, and subsequent investigations showed that it was a political hit uh, that came the out of the Hillary Clinton campaign. Subsequent information that's come to light in the last 6 months or so is now showing the involvement of, or at least the awareness by the Obama administration of what was going to happen. And there were elements of the Russian interference claim which were quite salacious. They came out of 4chan as a joke. And so, yeah, there are plenty of people, generally not people with loud voices, who were laughing non-stop at these claims because they knew where they came from. They knew how much they were, how uh, inaccurate they were, how much they were lies. And even the media at the time refused to initially bite because they were like, this doesn't meet enough standard to go. And then, well, I guess it's been a downward spiral ever since. So, yeah, it's no allegation, evidence of serious misconduct in Trump's team. So I saw an interview with Comey about Flynn, about General Flynn, and he said that basically the FBI went, well, we can rush people down to the White House and get them in to talk to Flynn without going through White House counsel and everything else. So they basically broke protocol in order to do this. And Comey basically said, well, basically every other White House would have told us to pound sand. Went in, managed to trap him in a misstatement, which then claimed that he was lying, and that was what General Flynn was being hounded for, was the FBI thing. Um, Paul Manafort, well, I don't think it was a Russian alliance. I mean, that was a Papadopoulos they tried to set up. There was a couple of them where it was quite clearly sting operations that were set up to try and take down members of um, Trump's team and things like that. It's just like, well, uh, it's terrible, terrible. Yep, I agree. Trump has certainly got a thirst for revenge on it, but it's honestly, it's as he says, it should be done through the process, not for revenge. So it'll be. I mean, it's not unexpected that it's uh, New York Times. Well, there you go. So New York Times and Washington Post both come out whinging and crying about Trump. There's, in addition to the payouts, there's a very, very big reason that came out in the last 24 hours. What do you mean it's been? Oh, I missed the article. Hang on a sec. There we go. So, first Trump administration, he achieved the Abraham Accords, which was in essence Israel. Well, it was kind of Israel and Gaza a little bit, but certainly a chilling, well, not chilling, a settling down of the relationships between Israel and other nations through the Middle East. Just excuse me for a sec. Right. So yeah, the Abraham Accords, and yeah, I mean that was a wonderful thing. I mean, certainly on the level I think of the Daytona Accords from back in the day, and then this pops out, and people, depending on who you listen to, there was a rumor building for the last 3 or 4 days that the US had a Gaza solution. Now, people were joking, oh yeah, Trump's going to take over Gaza and turn it into the Gaza Trump Towers and things like this. But Trump was saying, well, I don't know who Trump was saying, but there was certainly a rumor building that Trump might have something in that regard. Now, people sort of dismissed it because, like, yeah, and that sort of stuff's come up plenty of times in the past. Yeah. Um, then this pops up out of nowhere, which has basically Trump and coming up with well, I don't know how much of his plan, but has basically come out with Netanyahu saying, all right, here's our agreement. And it's a 20-point plan. And Israel has basically signed on. And what I'd heard previously was that, well, the Palestinians were kind of okay with it, but this now requires Hamas to buy into it, or at least the Palestinians to buy into it. Hamas may not like it so much because it basically tells them to pound sand, but the rest of it is quite decent. Um, I don't know if this article will have the list, but uh, it will basically give them the opportunity. It'll keep Israel out. I mean, Israel's already left Gaza at least once before. Um, the administration of Gaza will be a multinational effort, and that the key plan is, well, there'll be a ceasefire, all hostages released, Hamas will be disarmed, and Israel will back out altogether. Netanyahu said, yep, approval from all sides is beyond very close. So it sounds like Hamas is yet to buy in. So Qatari and Egyptian mediators on Monday, it's Tuesday. So we'll see. AFP's obviously heavily involved. They'll get a response. It says there's many elements to be clarified. Now I've seen a rundown of the 20 points. I don't know how accurate it is, but it'll be interesting to see. So Gaza security, Netanyahu would of course say that. He also doubts whether the Palestinian Authority will get a role in Gaza's governance. I think they probably should. I mean, I know where the Palestinian Authority came out of, but at the end of the day, um, they're probably more desirable than Hamas. So to have a Palestinian state that doesn't have the Palestinian Authority, well, I don't know. But they've agreed to it. And people are like, I think there's a lot of surprise, really. I don't know how many people were aware of this coming into it, but most people are warming to it, at least other nations and everything else. And so the pressure is now on Hamas specifically, and so France and the UK and regular people popping out. It's quite a quite an interesting deal. It certainly puts a lot of pressure now on Hamas, especially with Israel having signed on and with growing support from everyone else. This is, I mean, for all the other ceasefires and peace agreements Trump's achieved already this year, this administration, if he achieves this, uh, well, peace in the Middle East, I guess. Oh, like I said, that's why the stream was late this morning because I sat down, I was having a quick look at this. So they're welcoming the role and the sincere efforts. They're not necessarily buying in completely. I mean, these statements are still very political, but yeah, they're, they're, there's a lot of the Arab world and the Islamic world buying in as well. Yeah, Gaza's skeptical, but meh. All right, here we go. So here's a list. So it'll be de-radicalized, terror-free zone. Well, I don't know how you achieve that. Gaza will be redeveloped. Okay, fine. That takes external investment. If accepted by both sides, ceasefire immediately, or basically peace immediately. Israeli forces. So there's a diagram floating around that shows a staged withdrawal to then a complete withdrawal from Gaza by Israeli forces, but immediately provides an Israel-free zone um, within Gaza for the population and everyone else. It's not a complete withdrawal prior to the hostage release, so the hostages will come out before the full withdrawal. Military ops suspended, battle lines frozen. Within 72 hours, all hostages alive, dead, and in between will be returned. Once they've returned, now this is obviously so Israel's obviously given ground on some things. 250 life sentence prisoners plus 1,700 Gazans detained after October 7, 2023, including all women and children. For every Israeli hostage whose remains are released, Israel will return 15 deceased Gazans as well. So I suspect that Israel suddenly got the upper hand in a couple of places, but not to the point that they wanted to eradicate Gaza. It sounds like there was enough of an upper hand. But to get Israel to agree to this, I someone's made a big promise somewhere. Someone's getting something out of this. Not just Israel and Palestine. There's a third party giving a lot to somebody for Israel to do this, to give up this. So after the return, Hamas will disarm and accept. So who disarm and accept coexistence will receive amnesty, while those choosing to leave Gaza will be granted safe passage abroad, but no guarantee of other nations taking them. This is going to be hard because part of the charter of Hamas is the destruction of the state of Israel. This is, in essence, calling for the dissolution of Hamas, plain and simple. Uh, that I think is where you're going to find struggle. Now, where they're going to go, I don't know. Plus, I don't know who wants to take them. Other Jordan, Egypt, UAE, Lebanon, they don't want them. So, yep, okay. Aid, entry and distribution of aid, that's not a problem. Okay. So, temporary technocratic Palestinian committee managing public services, yep, that's fine. Then there'll be an international transitional body, the Board of Peace. Um, well, that explains there. That goes to explain why Tony Blair suddenly popped up out of nowhere about 2 weeks ago and suddenly appeared in the US and suddenly made some comments about a couple of things. It's because he got brought in for this. So it's not just Trump doing this. He's obviously brought together a whole bunch of people, and people have kept their mouths shut in terms of not leaked it. That's well, good for not leaking stuff, but also incredible that he's pulled all these people in, and also, yeah, like I said, explains why Blair popped up out of nowhere recently. Um, provide oversight and funding for redevelopment until the reformed Palestinian Authority is ready to resume control. Okay, fine. Um, yeah, I'm sure there's going to be an article about why Tony Blair's back, but anyway. Uh, Development plan, rebuild Gaza through a panel of experts behind successful Middle Eastern cities. Uh, International investment proposals will be integrated, create jobs, offer them a future. A special economic. Okay. I listened to. Is it a YouTube video? No, it's a podcast. There's a podcast talking about, it might have been 99% Invisible or one of those sort of things, talking about special economic zones. And I'm not 100% sure why I was listening to that particular podcast, but it talked about why the airport at Shannon in Ireland was so important in even in the age of true transatlantic air travel because there was no requirement for the larger jets to land there. And it was where duty free, like the airport duty free concept was created, which borrowed from the duty free concept on shipping, on liners, and things like that. But when airport duty free started dropping off, the guy behind it created the idea of a special economic zone, which was a duty free place for manufacturing and import export. And so, whilst the state of Ireland was going to miss out on duties because it's duty free, what it meant was by having these factories and these tech um, built there, the local population would be employed, they'd gain tech training and skilling and things like that, and so would then bring that back into the rest of the population, the rest of the state of Ireland. And so basically upskilling the population, improving the standard of living because people would still live in Ireland. They don't live in the SEZ. And so it was the success. Now, that then became the model for special economic zones around the world. Not all of them are successful. I mean, some are very, very much exploiting workers and they're used to um, basically for near slave labor like conditions. But it's where you get a lot of places like the Schengen? No, that's not the right word. Shenzhen. So the reason why Shenzhen is so big in China is, well, one, it's on the other side of the border from Hong Kong, but two, it was created as a special economic zone. And so you've got all this high tech electronics development and production and stuff done in the special economic zone. And yeah, I mean, it means China misses out on a bit of duty, but it skills, upskills, and everything else. So the some of the examples of SEZs that work are in China, but by and large, they kind of lost the impact that they once had. But the problem is for Gaza or for Israel, for the Palestinians, great. It's great for attracting investment to a degree. You still got to deal with labour costs, and there are still a variety of rules and regulations you have to abide by. But it um, isn't all sunshine and rainbows. I mean, it certainly will attract development faster than other methods, but it comes at the cost of protections to the population. The working population also comes at the cost of some regulation in terms of how business is conducted. So uh, it's a solution, and it probably a good one for now. It probably shouldn't stay long term though. No one will be forced to leave Gaza. Those who want to leave, free to do so in return. So given basically rights. However, encourage people to stay. Hamas and other factions will have no further role managing Gaza. All military and terror infrastructure will be dismantled, which I thought was an interesting requirement. Monitored demil with weapons decommissioned, and they're talking about destruction of all tunnel systems and stuff. So we may get to see the extent and whether or not they were under hospitals and stuff. Okay, guarantee by regional partners that won't pose threats. Well, I mean, that's interesting because this is like it puts an impost on the region as well, and probably gives that alone probably gives Israel a degree of security as well, given the history of conflicts they've had with their regional neighbours since 1948. Um, the US with Arab international partners form temporary national stabilisation force to deploy in Gaza, will train Palestinian police, coordinate with Jordan and Egypt, and work with Israel and Egypt to secure borders, block smuggling, and ensure the safe flow of goods. That's the first time Israel's mentioned in terms of reconstruction. So they really are talking about keeping Israel out. Israel will not occupy or annex Gaza. Well, they didn't do that before. They'll withdraw in stages under agreed milestones. Fair enough. Until a full withdrawal is complete. Fair enough. A security perimeter will remain until it's secure. Okay, that might take a while. In the event Hamas delays or rejects the proposal, the above, including the scale-up aid operation, will proceed in designated terror-free areas, handed over to the ISF. An interfaith dialogue process, tolerance and coexistence. Gaza's redevelopment progresses and reforms take hold. Hopefully there'll be a credible path to Palestinian self-determination and statehood, reflecting the aspirations of the Palestinian people. That is an incredible, that would be amazing if that was achieved. And basically we'll continue to liaise between the two. Yeah, I mean, that was SBS. BBC probably has something very similar. Yep, Trump and Netanyahu agree to the peace plan, looking for 72 hours. Palestinian Authority says yep. So this is largely going to follow. So we go all the way to the bottom. Okay, they don't do the byline down there. No, these guys aren't. I mean, it looks like they're taking it, but yeah, its tunnels and weapon production facilities would be destroyed from Hamas, and yeah, that'll be telling to see when that happens, if that happens. That's really interesting. I mean, and again, obviously everyone's supporting. Again, it's largely an interesting thing. But yeah, I mean, and I can see a lot of people, I mean, all the rest of the nations or everybody then buying into the fact that the Palestinian state will exist. Yeah, that doesn't need a little walkout, and hopefully won't see the same next time Netanyahu speaks or the Israeli leader speaks in the General Assembly. And I mean, this was performative because most of the people who walked out weren't even the delegates. They were random UN staffers and people within the offices of various um, UN offices that were basically sent in to seat and then get up and leave. 89 plus nations stayed to listen. So yeah, it's that was very much performative. Uh, da, 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 da. So yeah, that's the BBC. So we had the SBS at the start there. We'll see what the ABC has to say on it. Well, yeah, Netanyahu's agreed. I'm going to go to the bottom and see, well, by Brad Ryan, but he's going to say with wires. Yep. Okay, so the 21 points, 20 points, 21 points. Um, which, yeah, I mean, the extent to which the Qataris were involved with this, uh, yeah. I mean, it's interesting that the uh, US was able to get out of Israel, that they expressed regret that in targeting Hamas leadership during hostage negotiations, Israel violated Qatari sovereignty and affirmed that Israel will not conduct such an attack again in the future. I, I, I don't, I really find the US Israel relationship at the moment an interesting one. Because there's times when it looks like Trump's going to hold their feet to the fire, and other times that it looks like Israel does whatever they want, which they've generally done in the past. And so it's this is interesting to see how it how it rolls. And um, well, people got hope and things, which is good. People are a bit skeptical, but it's well, the plan is unrealistic, says some dude in Gaza. Well, it's a game. We, the people, are the ones paying the price. Yes, sadly, that's the truth. The thing about Netanyahu arriving at the White House was no pomp or ceremony. People saying that he sort of arrived at the working door of the West Wing, and that came through that way. Uh, Whereas there was no colour party and all the other bits and pieces, the pomp and ceremony just wasn't there, which implies that, well, Trump had a little bit of ability to force Israel, well, not force, direct Israel to come and do things and make things happen. So, yeah, the big question is whether or not Hamas agrees. So, this is the Sydney Morning Herald's read on it. Yes, Hamas has got a fairly big um, thing to face on it. So, yeah, the proposal, yeah, they can't let bygones. They just can't celebrate a win. It's only a vague promise. Yeah, it's more than it's closer than anything else, really. Okay, so responses. What the Sydney Morning Herald has a talk to people. So this is their previous works that they've said, "Oh no, we've got a right to resist. We've rejected disarmament in the past." Okay, well that's no need for that to be there, really. But like again, it's like most people are confronting it. This, though, is interesting. It's the first time I've seen anything talking about how it could face issues from within Israeli politics. And yep, a coalition, you have problems. And Israel's had issues in the past with leaders that have sought peace. Is it Yitzhak Rabin, I think? That was the one who was assassinated, ostensibly because he was pursuing a peaceful solution with the Palestinian people. So yeah, there's an interesting thing. Okay, so there's different people. It could cause Netanyahu to lose his place in Israeli politics. There's various red lines, etc. Um, but it's like we can't allow the PA in Gaza or allow a Palestinian state. Well, it doesn't directly allow a Palestinian state, but it does everything but. And in practical terms, it's the common law marriage of international states, i.e., you live together long enough, the society deems you married. Um, if the 20 articles, if the 20 points go in, then yeah, it's pretty much a Palestinian state in all but name. So yeah, it will be interesting. Um, so you can believe that it may never successfully do so. Would they get all 20 points? I don't know. I don't know. Is there an opportunity to get far more than they've ever had before and actually be peaceful? I think so. All right. We're now going to hop. we've got three quick things before we finish. Um, First one, this is interesting. Now, so if no one's aware who Friendly Geordies is, he's an Australian YouTube political commentator. They say satirist, but basically uh, a political commentator, very left wing. Got himself in a bit of trouble going after um, top politicians in New South Wales for a bit, but had his place that he was renting firebombed back in 2022. Uh, Partially damaged the building, but has basically been talking about Sydney identities. And I think this is where he got himself into trouble. Now, the speculation at the time was that it was a politically based attempt, that it was probably some conservative or right wing idiot that was trying to target him for the stupid things that he says on the left. Well, not so much. The court case that's now come out shows that okay, it's a muscle for fire, haha, muscle for hire arsonist, who's been a lengthy resident of the prison system, that uh, one of the men at least gets a 5-year jail sentence. Uh, Stolen Mercedes with cloned plates. Before you even get beyond that, that's sort of indicative of organised crime, particularly in Sydney. That's when you see that sort of stuff, it's like, this isn't just some random conservative upset with Friendly Geordies running his mouth. And so he's saying that people were threatening dire consequences. And yeah, the rhetoric that surrounded it was that it was uh, for political reasons. But the police said, well, they believed it to be linked to a rather well-known organised crime group. Uh, and basically, Friendly Geordies folded in 2023. And whilst it says the motive not detailed or any details released, it implies that, yeah. Now, carefully, they say that he was not accused of being a part of the gang, but he was involved, and it talks about some of his other crime, etc., which, well, kind of not really important. Um, Plus, yeah, claims to whatever. Uh, yeah, it was interesting to see that suddenly pop up. I mean, I remember when the articles came up when it happened. It's like, ooh. But no, it turned out to be because he'd said things about people that he probably shouldn't. We talked the other days about skilled migration visas and the need for um, improved migration and stuff like that, and how there's been the polls showing that people don't think the government's doing a good job with migration at all, even amongst their supporters. This came up, and visa fraud in Australia. I don't know how widespread it is, but there is alleged a scam or a black market targeting Chinese people, selling places for spouses in permanent residency skilled visa applications. And people obviously wanting to jump the queue, so to speak. And so um, looking at basically pretending to act as family so that they could come in and gain access to the country. And so when people are dubious and look at uh, visa holders with a bit of there's a possible to rort the system, it's not so much targeting the ethnicity of the person who's holding the visa. It's a respecting, so it's a reflection of the idea that, yep, it's possible to corrupt the process, and that it seems that if the process is easily corruptible, then it diminishes the quality of, well, people holding the visa, not a mark on the individual. Diminishes the perceived quality of the visa itself. There we go. So, yeah, applications for family after one person gains the skilled entry, and then they be charged lots of money to come in. It's a bit like mail order brides. Um, the concept of people paying money for a mail order bride who comes in, gets married, stays married long enough to get the green card, then divorces, and is now able to run around and become a citizen um, for the US side of things. It happens. I mean, the whole idea of mail order brides a bit confusing for some people, but yeah, it's dubious. And I mean, this is why immigration authorities question people so hard on their visa applications and everything else, because, well, it's, I mean, why does this guy want to come to Australia? Or like, what's the purpose for his coming to Australia? And um, yeah, they 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 get through. Um, it's just yeah, and uh, well, this guy ultimately doesn't even get through the process. Has been run through the process to defraud the visa scheme, only then to find out that it was a faked process in the beginning. So he's applied to defraud the visa scheme to a visa holder who doesn't exist. So they've ripped him off in two different directions. Uh, but it it happens. It happens, and so uh, it, it's a problem. Dodgy migration agents who ripped off applicants through unlawful migration advice, and I mean there've been some people who've been caught out by that who've attempted to do the right thing, either already in the country on a visa and have gone to a migration agent to say, look, I need to change the conditions or whatever else, gets poor advice, uh, ends up overstaying their visa for whatever reason, and is then now an illegal migrant. So yeah, um, and protection visa scams. That's been going on for ages, for decades now. It's a thing when the boats really kicked off after in 2001. They started getting a lot more scams for protection visas in Australia as well, and it's just yeah, uh, they get caught out eventually, and then you get banned for um, well, basically unable to re-enter the country eventually. Uh, so yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting to see that pop up. That well, there's an active black market attempting to rot the skilled migration system. So we'll see how that goes. All right, we're going to rip through a bunch of government ones. First one to come up, which I thought was interesting, was the Queensland government has written off up to $4 million worth of COVID-19 fines years after they're issued. Now, the government said, look, it's standard debt collection practice. We're going to write it off after X amount of time. More than 4,000 infringements were referred during the pandemic. The outstanding value comes in about $7.5 million, which included debt collector fees, but they've now finalised all debts, so they've written them off. Part had been paid in full or part, but about 2160, so 2000 plus, was still written off. Is it part of the fact that a Conservative government's now in Queensland? Possibly, but they've said, look, 5 years after the pandemic began, it's time to move on and finalise outstanding matters. Uh, Withdrawn, whatever. Overall, they've written no, not related to the pandemic. So not just that. It's interesting that that's taking place. We had the article last week from the former chief health officer of Victoria, saying that they made a mess of things. We've got articles talking about a decline in immunisation rates for a handful of reasons. The one reason that is different historically is declining trust because of COVID, the way COVID was handled. And then you've now also got, in a very tiny line at the very bottom here, the New South Wales government also announcing they're going to withdraw and repay tens of thousands of fine issued during the pandemic. The complaints that people were saying that the governments were becoming authoritarian and overreaching their remit and all the other bits and pieces, which those claims were suppressed because Google deleted those sort of accounts, and so did Facebook and everybody else. You couldn't go around and say that sort of stuff. It seems that history and COVID is not as clear cut as people are claiming it was. And we'll see what happens as it goes forward. That's going to be interesting. But sticking with health stuff and difficulties getting access to qualified and skilled people and everything else, this is an interesting change. So there are limits in Australian medical system on who can diagnose a condition, for example. So it needs to be a trained, qualified doctor or a clinical psychologist in the case of certain psychological conditions. As far as I'm aware, they're the only two classes of individual or who can diagnose a medical condition. Now, the doctor can be a GP or a specialist, whatever, as long as they're fully trained and qualified. I don't think a nurse practitioner can, but the clinical psychologist can. And again, I'm not 100% sure about how that breaks down, but that is the case. So if you're not a clinical psychologist, but you're acting as a psychologist, you can't diagnose. It's got to be a clinical one. So yeah, anyway, whatever. The thing we're looking at here is nurses. We have a thing called a nurse practitioner, who is like a super highly qualified registered nurse operating in a GP clinic who is somewhat between a nurse and a doctor. Um, they have the ability to handle independently a range of minor issues, but they don't have the full powers of a doctor in terms of diagnoses and prescription and stuff. What we're seeing in this article, which has just popped up overnight, is the idea that registered nurses will soon be able to prescribe. So that means they'll get a Medicare number and everything else. In partnership with an authorised health practitioner. Well, that's okay. There may be places kind of doing that in practice, but now they've got the legal process to do it. I mean, it would always have been the GP's signature or the specialist's signature, but the nurse will have been dealing with a case the whole way through and would be like, okay, it's pretty obvious that this is the medication that you're going to be put on, and the doctor will then go, yep, that's right, and sign off on it. Cool. And the idea is to help address health workforce shortages, enhance access to medicine, particularly in rural and remote areas. Great idea. So You've got um, uh, improving the ability to deliver the most common health services to people and alleviating pressure on GPs and everything else. I think it's only fair that it's not a blanket provision, that there will be um, limitations on the type of drugs and everything else that can be applied and provided and whatnot. So, yeah, it obviously they'll have to undergo specific training to do it. Obviously, doctors are going to whine about things. Um, okay, medical doc. So prescribed. So that means having a Medicare number. Uh, Doctors, dentists. Okay, well that's kind of a doctor of kind. Optometrists, some pharmacists, nurse practitioners. Okay, well there you go. Nurse practitioners could and endorse midwives. So, yep, the additional postgrad training, like I just said, expands their skilling. RNs may only have a, well, see, the funny thing is, a GP only has a bachelor's degree, um, and registration haven't previously been allowed to prescribe. So back in the day, I mean, not even that long ago. So you got two classes of nurse effectively in the Australian system. You have the enrolled nurse and you have the registered nurse. Now, your registered nurses are your RNs, and your enrolled nurses are your ENs. And back in the day, it would have been that was your student nurse because you were either living in the nurses' quarters and you were working basically your nursing apprenticeship, but the whole time you were working, you were still a nurse. You were an enrolled nurse. And then once you qualified, you became a registered nurse. There was I don't know for how long, and sort of an in-between level. They were still an enrolled nurse, an EN, but they were an EEN, an endorsed enrolled nurse. And what they had over an EN was specific medication training. They had a much more detailed medications training and skilling than your everyday EN. And so they were more like an RN in terms of what they could handle and process medication wise compared to an EN who was, yep, no, don't touch that. That's bad. So then that EEN, the endorsed enrolled nurse, went away and ENs just became became ENs. And well, I don't know. I think that's the status as it is now. So yes, allowing RNs to who aren't nurse practitioners or midwives. Yeah, no, I think that's great, especially like it when it's pretty clear what the medication is going to be and is going to be repeated. Yeah, perfectly fine. So what do they need to do? They need more postgrad quals, adequate clinical experience, and then 6 months clinical mentorship with an authorised practitioner, and then have a full partnership with the prescribing agreement and set things up, which I think is pretty fair. It's going to make things a lot better. Um, yeah, uh, many of the same drugs, etc. Now, my GP, for example, said that there's some drugs he can't prescribe or won't prescribe, I guess. Um, so yeah, no, I think it's brilliant, especially for people like living in regional areas who don't have access to the major cities and everything else. Yep, okay, you have concern about doctors and nurses. I think it's a brilliant thing, especially when you talk about the difficulty accessing healthcare in regional Australia. But speaking of healthcare and things like development, there's a concern here in Queensland where a council has rejected a DA, basically a developmental approval extension. So they're putting in a whole bunch of homes targeting the over 50s. So you're looking at people who are going to start having increased health needs as they get older. So it's a semi-retirement community. However, the council said no, they're not going to extend it to allow hospital and retirement facilities to be incorporated in. Queensland Health says, "Oh, we've got a plan to put it in, put one in, a hospital in, but yeah, well, when that's going to happen, no one knows. It's a future indeterminate government promise." So quite logically, the council is being people having to go with the council for um, not extending planning support for um, the for a hospital and retirement facility, particularly if with that over 50s development going in. 3 doctor surgeries, so 3 GP clinics, but a 90-minute drive to Bundy or Gladstone. Now, we talked about the other week about the pipeline in regional Australia from towns with no hospitals through to your base hospitals, your regional hospitals, so to your district hospitals, your regionals, your base hospitals, all the way up to the majors and the big cities. And the fact you've got a 90-minute drive, that's a reality. You can't have a hospital everywhere, unfortunately. And so a 90-minute drive, that's part of the risk you take living on the coast in places like this. You, yeah, I mean, it would be good if they could have it, but yeah, is there enough to support it? Who knows? I mean, it seems like a good plan, but it'll only be a small hospital by the look of things. If that's a living unit, that's a pretty small hospital. If that's a 5, yeah, that's a pretty small hospital. But look, I mean, they were preliminarily approved and then they got cancelled. Uh, but then you've only got a population of 3,000 people, which, okay, yep, holiday periods gets more, but is that worth running around putting a full hospital in? Is that going to be supported? I mean, a town I lived in had 6,000 people, had a hospital. Town I lived in had 2,000 people, also had a hospital, but it was a small thing. That town, though, had a lot of um, people coming in, tourist traffic. So the the permanent population was 2,000 people. The day-to-day population is probably 6 to 8, and also then fed in support from regional areas, like local areas came in there as well. Town I was born in, sorry, place I lived as a little kid, I wasn't born in that town because it didn't have a hospital, and I'm come to think of it, still doesn't have one. The places after I left high school, where my parents moved to, had no hospital or doctor. So medical care was you had to drive to the next town, which did have a hospital plus doctors. Just trying to think. Then they moved to a place that had a hospital, and then they moved to a place that doesn't have a hospital. So yeah, regional Australia, still plenty of places even now that you can live that don't have hospitals. So I mean, 3,000, I don't know. Yep, great to have a hospital. Yep, if your health services don't meet your needs, yes, you're gonna have to move. Sad to say. But that also leads to depopulation of regions too, which makes it even harder to support the need to have hospitals. Um, yeah. So sticking with development and um, lifestyle and things, I think this is going to go back to the report released the other week about the number of how much people need for retirement and people working into age, um, and the number of women with sufficient retirement funding. Yeah, I expect. I mean, this headline shouldn't come as a surprise to most people. It's almost to be expected based on the average woman's earnings over her lifetime. Um, by virtue of the fact that they've stopped to raise kids, etc. I mean, there is an increasing, I guess, an increasing number of people who never have a family and probably going to go through the system um, as individuals as opposed to couples or married, etc. So that changes their accessibility to things. Most of those women are paid at the same rate as males. I mean, certainly the whole gender pay gap seems to be based on um, the them leaving the workforce to have and raise families. Um, a lot of the examples, like a lot of the gender pay gap, is a myth because there is legislation to ensure equal pay for equal work in a lot of places. Funnily enough, in the Australian system, when it was looked at a lot closer, where there were gaps in pay for people doing the equivalent jobs, doing the same jobs at the same level, was actually in a lot of the big contracting firms to government and everything else who audited other people and things like that. G'day, Suli Minogue. Minogue? Minogle? Is it an I or an L? We're just having a chat. We're running through the tail end of today's Just Chatting stuff, um, ticking off over some Australian social and in regional type stuff at the moment. So talking about the issue about women arriving at retirement with lower superannuation levels than men. And I mean, we had articles previous week about the increasing amount of money people need for super, and well, people are also dipping into their super, pulling it out for to pay for house deposits and all sorts of bits and pieces. So yeah, women um, tend to be impacted by events that lead to them drawing down on their superannuation, which can lead to almost 100,000 less. Now, just today, today I heard, no, it was last night. Yesterday, I was having a chat to someone. I hadn't talked to them about the idea that a lot more people are now retiring in their 70s, and they were saying that their parents were extending their working life. They were all set to retire a year or two ago. That was the plan. They're now going to work until they're 69. For no other reason than they think they've still got some years of working left in them. I think it's also going to be to help their retirement. A big part of their retirement, I believe, is going to be funded by sale of their current property. But an extra year or two of money going into their super scheme is going to certainly help their ability to have a higher standard of living. I think, to my understanding, that they're going to be going in living with family um, later on, but yeah, it's certainly going to help boost getting them across the line. So yeah, there is a gap, but the question is, if the superannuation gap is impacted by events, what do? Do you stop people from pulling down on their super? You can't change the events that people go through. Do you pay women at a higher rate than men so that this gap narrows? Do you have potentially more like a minimum guaranteed outcome? That kind of sounds like the pension, to be honest. Uh, yes, there's going to be a gap, and it's like, well, it comes down to earning differential, really. Um, there's it's one thing to write a report and complain about the gap. It's another thing to have an equitable approach to fixing it. And I can't think of an equitable solution as to what would easily do that. And yes, the problem, especially for women at the lower end of the earning spectrum, is that they risk poverty in retirement. To be quite honest, the uh, old pension-based retirees from back in the day, and I mean, when I was at high school, lady next door to us, uh, yeah, lady next to us was basically on the government pension and was living a very, very meager lifestyle because that was her income. That was what she earned. Um, and I think that certainly helped motivate my parents to push their superannuation and retirement planning a lot further along. But yeah, and you've then got complicating factors. We talked about the other day about if you weren't with a mortgage by a certain age bracket, chances are that you're going to enter retirement as a renter, not a landowner, not a house owner or mortgage holder. And so that places it was observed in the figures to put them at a slight disadvantage compared to the homeowner and mortgage holder. It means you also avoid some other issues that come with home owning, but it also then means you've got no asset to help offset the costs when you enter aged care, like permanent aged care, and that can be very, very expensive. So it limits people's future choices. And so, same thing here about policies allowing people to withdraw super for home deposits and other lifestyle events or life events hurts long-term retirement chance. And I said, well, what do? Do you prevent people drawing down on the super? Well, that then means that they have difficulty arriving. And we go, life events affecting um, the outcome. And, well, yeah, uh, it's difficult. It's difficult. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that the Labor government is pushing in for things like this. Um, obviously, you don't want people to have gaps going into into living standards, but that's a bit of a sad statistic. I don't know what the good solution there is. I honestly don't. I don't know if there can be a good solution, or at least an equitable one. We talked about coastal living, where places like um, Byron Bay have basically priced out the locals. Well, up in the snow country, in the high country, you've got similar sorts of issues. So Jindabyne, it's a relatively small settlement. I think the biggest town near it is Cooma, but Jindabyne's kind of the settlement on the outside of the Kosciuszko National Park and the snowfield. So if you want to go to the snowfields in from the New South Wales side, if you go to the Victorian side, you've got Mount Hotham, Mount Beauty. You've got a bunch of places in the Victorian high country that you can still access from and people live at and stuff like that. From the New South Wales side, mainly you're looking at Tumut, Cooma, Jindabyne. Cooma and Tumut a little bit further out. Tumut's accessed from the west, Cooma from the northeast. Jindabyne's sort of like right on the limit, right on the edge. I mean, you had smaller settlements. You used to have some smaller settlements at Aminibee. I mean, Guthiga's inside. Smiggan Holes. I mean, there's Thredbo is about the only permanent settlement permitted inside the national park. There are some places, but they're mainly for the Snowy Hydro scheme. But yeah, your other places like Adaminaby, even smaller, tiny, tiny, tiny settlements. Great for fly fishing, but um, the biggest town as such is Jindabyne, and then further away is Cooma. But so the issue with Jindabyne is, well, you've got high property prices, limited housing stock, but the problem is a lack of high income jobs or high enough income jobs for the locals to afford them. And so, uh, yeah, a quarter of the homes now are Airbnb slash short term rentals. It prevents the locals from taking a long term rental, plus the cost is going to be rather high. And obviously, in the low season, there's no one around. The population still can't move in. So yeah, 4,000 people for most of the year. Monster numbers uh, during winter. They've also the bottom end of the ski tube as well, and so massive numbers. But yeah, the locals can't rent in because, well, Airbnb and other short-term rentals take off, and so yeah, the house will sit empty for 3/4 of the year because it's very much worth it coming out. Now, Berridale, tiny little place, even further out, but still got to move in. Average house price is over $1 million. Now, $1 million, there's not, there isn't the income in town, there isn't the economic base in town to support a lot of people being able to afford that. And 85% rent increases in 5 years, that's just insane. So, yeah, it's forcing people out. Like I said, for other places as well, you force your locals to live elsewhere. So 30-minute commute, and he's living out in the middle of the bush. That's that's insane, to be honest. That's insane. So yeah, someone who owns their own house couldn't afford it if she didn't have additional outcome. It's yeah. People have even moved to Canberra. Now, Canberra's got high prices too. It's just yeah, pricing out the locals. I mean, eventually it'll collapse a little, I guess. But yeah, there's the problem. It's like you can't throw too many more houses or places in. Um, there you go. The problems, suggestions all over the place. Um, yeah, it's struggling. Um, so yeah, that was interesting. And then to compound the problems for people, the Sydney Morning Herald popped up and said there's suburbs where, well, despite rate cuts and everything else, people are unable to meet mortgage costs now. The fortnightly payments on a $500,000 mortgage, 30-year mortgage, 25, 30-year mortgage, you're looking at least uh, 1,500 a fortnight. I might actually be a bit off. Um, There's mortgage calculators out there, you'll see them. But that's not counting the deposit you had to pay. Got if you've bought in the major cities with your 10% deposit, maybe even a 20-cent deposit, you're still looking at a $750,000 mortgage. Um, so the cost to service that is probably 2,000 plus a fortnight. So that's $1,000 a week cash in hand you've got to have that you're then going to hand over to the bank and never see again. And that's just to service the basic cost. You're not going to get ahead on that rate. So yeah, great. The rates are being cut, but the outer suburbs, where they're lower income, uh, well, people find affordability, but also where people have lower incomes. Yeah, no surprise you're going to fall behind on mortgage payments compared to the places where people with more money live. Not a surprise, but the arrears level is generally pretty low. Like we're not anywhere near a global financial crisis type level, like sub 1%. Okay, the ACT is at 1%. But yeah, people are not expecting, it's actually today, it should be happening right now, um, the cash rate to change. So it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, 1%, um, although you've got places where you almost triple that rate for people being arrears. And it's, yeah, how do you manage that? Um, Debt to income levels are insane when you've got such a high mortgage stress. Once the rates go up, if they go up by 2%, you're going to see a lot of people distress sales coming on the market, um, and prices just keep going up. So yeah, you're going to struggle to find. Uh, that said, the Sydney Morning Herald at the same time had an article that said that some people are whining that housing reforms have gone too far, others saying they haven't gone far enough. And uh, there was the planning law changes previously, but the reforms are basically to try and expedite um, expedite development approvals. But then you've got the NIMBYism starting to come out, not in my backyard, where people are saying, look, now my beautiful leafy suburb is starting to get overdeveloped. Well, that just means you can't have the poors living anywhere near you. And so it's like, well, there is a long way to go for more affordable housing, but the problem is it's like historically low density housing. So there's still, yep, a lot more medium and high density housing, but we've covered several articles about people complaining about high density housing going in. Now, in part, it's because the infrastructure isn't there to support it, but also in part it's because, well, you're going to ruin my view. And uh, yeah, it's yeah, our density is nothing like a lot of other cities around, a lot of other countries around the world, even in density stuff. So yeah, 5Ks from the Sydney CBD, more than 50% of residential land is low density. One or two homes per block, rarely more than 2 stories. It's insane. I mean, it's a beautiful part of Sydney's aesthetic appeal, but it means there's a cap on the number of people who can live there, and it means that prices are stupidly insane because people are trying to get through. And so we've got nearly 6 million people trying to live in a place that half the land is zoned low density. Yeah, yeah. People complaining about a high story, an 11-story building going in. Uh, yeah, there's a lot of people complaining. So it's got to change if they want if they want to support the population. It's got to be met with equivalent um, equivalent improvements in infrastructure. Yeah, probably never one good answer. And okay, that's the video. All right, we might call it there. Actually, let's close it out. Huh, I didn't know the camera position had shifted. Anyway, put some tunes up. All right. Big thank you to everyone coming out today, the regulars, the first timers, the lurkers, the chatters, and everyone in between. The channel would not be the same without you, so thank you all for being here. Our next stream is going to be tomorrow night. It's Spooktober, so I'm looking at a variety of spooky games that we're going to look at playing over the month of October. I will stick with Pillars of Eternity on Wednesday nights because, well, there's some interesting horror elements throughout that game. They're not necessarily designed as horror elements, but in practice, that's what they are. And even Friday's Prince of Persia Warrior Within, there's elements in there that you could say is horror, but yeah, we'll see. Other than that, if you want to keep up and see what's next, check the socials, mainly Twitter and Insta. Messages go out on both of those before each stream, indicating what, where, when. The YouTube channel should indicate the next stream coming up if I get ahead of the game. And the Discord will pick up the Twitter and Insta messages as well as punching a message out when the stream goes live. The Discord also has our giveaway, which this week is for a copy of My Time at Sandrock. So if you want in on that, head over to the Discord. And you'll find a channel called Giveaways. Head in there, find the blue button, click the blue button, automatically in the draw. Other than that, again, big thank you to everyone coming out today. And we'll see you all again next stream.